Every morning, he worked in the engine room, fixing pipes and maintaining ship systems. His fellow sailors saw him as just another quiet naval engineer. But when darkness fell over the Yellow Sea, he would slip into the water with breathing apparatus and demolition charges, targeting enemy submarines and harbor installations. For 3 years aboard the USS Missouri, no one knew he was one of the most elite underwater demolition specialists the Navy had ever trained. Until that night when everything changed, and his true identity was revealed in the most dangerous way possible. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we dive into this story of hidden courage beneath the waves of Korea, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe legends like Petty Officer Johnson deserve to be remembered, subscribe to witness stories that time forgot, but history never will. The USS Missouri cut through the gray waters of the Yellow Sea in March 1951, her massive hull displacing thousands of tons as she maintained her patrol route along the Korean peninsula. The battleship's crew of over 2,700 men had settled into the rhythm of war, long hours of maintenance punctuated by moments of intense combat when North Korean forces attempted coastal operations. Deep in the engine room, beneath the armored deck that protected the ship's vital systems, Petty Officer Second Class Robert "Bobby" Johnson worked with methodical precision. His hands, permanently stained with grease and oil, moved expertly through the maze of pipes, valves, and machinery that kept the Missouri operational. At 26, Bobby had the kind of practical knowledge that came from growing up in the shipyards of Norfolk, Virginia, where his father had taught him that every bolt, every joint, every system on a ship had a purpose. To his fellow sailors, Bobby Johnson was unremarkable in the best possible way. He arrived for his shift in the engine room at 0600 hours, spent his day maintaining the systems that kept the Missouri's massive engines running, and finished his duties with quiet efficiency. During meal times, he sat with the other engineering petty officers, listening more than talking, occasionally offering dry observations about the peculiarities of naval machinery or the challenges of keeping equipment operational in saltwater environments. Bobby's bunk was in the enlisted quarters on Deck 3, surrounded by the same men who worked alongside him every day. His personal effects were minimal: a few letters from home, technical manuals for ship systems, and a small photograph of a woman named Susan that he kept face down in his footlocker. When asked about the photograph, Bobby would simply say she was someone back home and change the subject. What none of his shipmates knew was that the photograph was of his UDT instructor from the Navy's underwater demolition training program at Fort Pierce, Florida. Bobby Johnson's real name was Lieutenant Robert Chen, and he had completed one of the most grueling military training programs in existence before being assigned to the Missouri under deep cover. Chen's mission was unlike anything the Navy had attempted before. While the Missouri provided fire support for UN forces along the Korean coast, Chen conducted covert underwater operations against North Korean naval installations. His cover as a ship's engineer was perfect. It explained his technical knowledge, his familiarity with maritime operations, and his presence aboard a frontline naval vessel. The UDT program had transformed Chen from a mechanical engineer into something far more dangerous. He had learned to approach enemy installations underwater, plant demolition charges with surgical precision, and disappear without leaving trace evidence. His specialty was sabotaging enemy submarines and coastal defense positions that conventional naval bombardment couldn't reach. Each night, while the Missouri anchored in relatively safe waters, Chen would slip away from his quarters and make his way to a sealed compartment near the ship's boat davits. Inside, hidden beneath maintenance equipment, was everything he needed for his real work: a Lambertson rebreather system, waterproof demolition charges, underwater navigation equipment, and a dry suit designed for extended operations in cold water. Chen's missions typically began around 0200 hours, when most of the crew was asleep and the Missouri's watch rotation was focused on surface threats. He would enter the water through a maintenance port near the ship's waterline, using equipment that had been carefully modified to operate silently. The North Korean coast was often less than 5 miles away, close enough for a trained underwater swimmer to reach under cover of darkness. The psychological challenge of maintaining his cover was immense. During the day, Chen had to project the competent but unremarkable persona of Petty Officer Johnson, discussing maintenance schedules and equipment problems with the same men who would have been shocked to learn about his nighttime activities. He had to show appropriate concern when the Missouri engaged North Korean positions, knowing that his underwater operations were often directly supporting those same bombardments. Chen's missions had already achieved remarkable success. In 6 months aboard the Missouri, he had destroyed 2 North Korean submarines in Wonsan Harbor, sabotaged coastal gun emplacements that threatened UN shipping, and planted listening devices that provided crucial intelligence about enemy naval movements. But his operations had to remain completely secret. If the North Koreans discovered that the Americans were conducting underwater sabotage missions, they would adapt their defenses and potentially compromise UN naval operations throughout the region. The engineering work that provided Chen's cover was genuine and demanding. The Missouri's engines required constant maintenance, and Chen's technical expertise was valuable to the ship's operations. He had become genuinely skilled at diagnosing mechanical problems, repairing complex systems under battlefield conditions, and training younger sailors in proper maintenance procedures. But the dual nature of his assignment created constant tension. Chen had to balance his cover duties with the physical and mental preparation required for underwater combat operations. He maintained his conditioning through exercises disguised as routine maintenance work, practiced breath-holding techniques while working in confined spaces, and mentally rehearsed mission procedures during the long hours of mechanical work. The mission that would expose Chen's true identity began with intelligence reports of a new North Korean naval facility being constructed in a heavily defended harbor near Hungnam. Reconnaissance flights had identified what appeared to be a submarine pen capable of sheltering multiple vessels, along with fuel storage facilities and torpedo workshops. The installation was too well defended for conventional naval bombardment and too important to ignore. Chen studied the intelligence reports while maintaining his cover as a ship's engineer reviewing technical specifications for a new maintenance project. The target represented exactly the kind of mission UDT specialists were trained for, but it would also be the most dangerous operation he had attempted since arriving in Korean waters. The briefing came through encrypted channels that officially didn't exist aboard the Missouri. Chen received his orders through a sealed pouch delivered during routine mail call, hidden among routine maintenance directives and technical bulletins. To anyone observing, it appeared that Petty Officer Johnson was simply reviewing standard Navy paperwork. The North Korean submarine facility at Hungnam represented a significant escalation in enemy naval capabilities. Intelligence indicated that Soviet advisors were helping to construct hardened submarine pens that could shelter up to 8 vessels, along with fuel storage capacity for extended operations and workshops for torpedo maintenance and modification. The facility's completion would allow North Korean submarines to operate more effectively against UN shipping lanes and amphibious operations. Chen's mission was to conduct a detailed reconnaissance of the facility, identify vulnerable points for future sabotage operations, and, if possible, plant demolition charges that would delay construction without revealing American involvement. The operation would require him to swim over 8 miles in enemy waters, penetrate a heavily guarded harbor, and work for several hours within sight of North Korean sentries. The Missouri's position off the Korean coast provided perfect cover for the mission. The ship's routine patrol pattern brought her within 5 miles of Hungnam every few days, close enough for an underwater approach but far enough to avoid arousing suspicion. Chen's absence from the ship would be covered by a carefully planned maintenance schedule that required him to work alone in sealed compartments during the early morning hours. Preparing for the mission required weeks of careful planning disguised as routine work. Chen studied harbor charts while ostensibly reviewing technical drawings for ship systems. He tested his equipment during regular maintenance dives beneath the Missouri's hull, checking for enemy mines and hull damage. He practiced underwater navigation techniques while conducting legitimate inspections of the ship's underwater fittings. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect. Chen had to maintain his cover as the quiet, competent Petty Officer Johnson while mentally preparing for an operation that could easily result in his death or capture. If caught, he would be on his own, the Navy would disavow any knowledge of his mission, and the Missouri would continue her patrol as if nothing had happened. 3 days before the mission, Chen began the final phase of preparation. He modified his rebreather system to provide extended underwater duration, waterproofed his demolition charges using techniques developed during UDT training, and prepared backup navigation equipment in case his primary systems failed. All of this work was conducted in the engineering spaces, disguised as routine maintenance on life support equipment. The night of the mission, March 18, 1951, the Missouri anchored in her usual position approximately 6 miles northeast of Hungnam. Weather conditions were ideal for underwater operations: calm seas, overcast skies that would limit visibility from shore, and a new moon that provided maximum darkness. Chen finished his evening duties in the engine room at 2,100 hours, reported to his quarters for normal sleep period, and waited. At 0130 hours, Chen quietly left his bunk and made his way through the ship's darkened corridors to his equipment cache. The Missouri's night watch was focused on surface threats and radar contacts, paying little attention to internal movement as long as it appeared routine. Chen had practiced this route dozens of times, timing his movement to avoid watch rotations and patrol schedules. In the sealed equipment compartment, Chen transformed from Petty Officer Johnson into Lieutenant Chen, UDT Specialist. He donned his dry suit, checked his rebreather system, and verified that his demolition charges were properly waterproofed and armed. His underwater navigation equipment included a compass, depth gauge, and waterproof watch synchronized with the Missouri's chronometer. The entry into the water was the most dangerous moment of any mission. Chen had to lower himself through a maintenance port near the ship's waterline without being detected by the Missouri's own sentries or creating any disturbance that might appear on sonar equipment. He entered the Yellow Sea silently, allowing the cold water to close over his head as he began the long swim toward the North Korean coast. The underwater approach to Hungnam took nearly 4 hours. Chen maintained a steady pace, conserving his oxygen while navigating by compass and timing. The water was murky with industrial runoff from the harbor, which provided concealment but made navigation more difficult. Twice, Chen had to dive deeper to avoid North Korean patrol boats that passed overhead, their engines creating vibrations he could feel through the water. As Chen approached the harbor, he could see the lights of the construction site through the dark water. Searchlights swept the surface irregularly, operated by sentries who were clearly alert but not expecting underwater intrusion. The submarine pens were still under construction, with concrete forms and steel reinforcement visible in the shallow water near the harbor's protected inner area. Chen spent over an hour conducting his reconnaissance, carefully documenting the construction progress and identifying vulnerable points for future sabotage operations. The fuel storage tanks were partially completed and unguarded, located in a position where demolition charges could cause maximum damage without immediately revealing American involvement. The submarine pens themselves were more heavily defended, but Chen identified several points where structural damage could delay completion for months. The placement of demolition charges required Chen to work within 50 meters of North Korean sentries. He could hear their conversations and cigarette lighters, could see the glow of their cigarettes reflected in the water. Each charge had to be placed with surgical precision, timed to detonate hours after Chen's departure, and positioned to appear as if caused by construction accidents rather than sabotage. As Chen completed his mission and began the return journey to the Missouri, he realized that the operation had taken longer than planned. Dawn was approaching, and he would be cutting close to the time when his absence might be noticed during morning watch rotations. The swim back to the ship required him to push his physical limits, using techniques learned during UDT training to maintain speed while conserving oxygen. But as Chen approached the Missouri's anchorage position, he discovered that the battleship was no longer where he had left her. The empty water where the USS Missouri should have been anchored created a moment of absolute terror that Chen had never experienced during UDT training. He floated in the pre-dawn darkness of the Yellow Sea, his rebreather system indicating dangerously low oxygen reserves, staring at an anchorage position that contained nothing but empty ocean. Chen's waterproof watch showed 0547 hours. He had been underwater for over 4 hours, conducting what should have been a routine reconnaissance and sabotage mission. But now, with dawn approaching and his oxygen running low, he was stranded in enemy waters with no immediate means of return to American forces. Fighting down panic, Chen forced himself to think systematically. Naval vessels didn't simply disappear without reason. The Missouri had either moved to respond to an emergency, been ordered to a new position, or was conducting evasive maneuvers to avoid enemy action. Chen's training had covered contingencies for mission complications, but being abandoned by his own ship represented a scenario that UDT instructors had described as survival dependent on individual initiative. Chen surfaced carefully, keeping only his head above water while scanning the horizon. The North Korean coast was visible as a dim line to the west, lights from Hungnam still glowing in the industrial haze. To the east, where American naval forces typically operated, Chen could see searchlights and what appeared to be muzzle flashes from naval gunfire. The Missouri hadn't abandoned him, she had moved to engage enemy forces. The sound of naval combat reached Chen across the water, the distinctive thunder of 16-inch guns from the Missouri's main battery, the sharper cracks of secondary armament, and the occasional whistle of incoming artillery from shore batteries. A major engagement was underway, and Chen was trapped between the opposing forces with no way to identify himself to either side. Chen's immediate survival depended on reaching friendly forces before his oxygen ran out or dawn exposed him to enemy observation. But swimming toward the sound of gunfire meant approaching an active combat zone where American ships would be focused on surface threats and unlikely to notice a lone swimmer. Swimming toward shore meant potential capture by North Korean forces who would have no reason to treat a captured frogman with anything resembling mercy. The decision came down to basic military logic: move toward friendly forces, regardless of risk. Chen began swimming east, toward the sound of American gunfire, using his remaining oxygen sparingly while staying submerged as much as possible. The water around him occasionally shook with the concussion of large-caliber naval gunfire, and Chen could see shell splashes in the distance as North Korean shore batteries attempted to engage the Missouri. As Chen approached the combat zone, he realized the scope of the engagement he had stumbled into. The Missouri was not alone. Chen could identify at least 3 other American warships by their muzzle flashes and the distinctive sound of their gunfire. This was a major naval operation, possibly the largest UN naval engagement since the war began. The irony was not lost on Chen. His demolition charges at Hungnam were scheduled to detonate at 0630 hours, just as this naval engagement was reaching its peak. The explosions would appear to be the result of American naval bombardment rather than sabotage, providing perfect cover for his covert operation. But only if he survived to see it. Chen's oxygen gauge reached critical levels as he approached the outer edge of the combat zone. American destroyers were maneuvering at high speed, their wakes creating dangerous conditions for a swimmer. Chen had to time his approach carefully, surfacing between ship movements while avoiding the searchlights that swept the water looking for enemy submarines or torpedo boats. At 0614 hours, Chen made the decision that would expose his true identity. He activated the emergency transponder hidden in his equipment vest, a device that would identify him to American forces as a friendly operative but would also reveal his presence to anyone monitoring naval communications. The transponder broadcast a coded signal indicating UDT operative requiring immediate extraction. The response was immediate. Searchlights from the nearest destroyer swung toward Chen's position, and he could hear engines changing pitch as ships moved to investigate. Chen surfaced fully, raising his arms above his head in the universal signal for surrender or assistance, hoping that American gunners would recognize him as friendly before opening fire. The USS Collet, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was the first to reach Chen's position. Her crew had received the transponder's signal and identified it as coming from classified operations, but they had no context for why a UDT operative would be operating in this area during a major naval engagement. As Chen was pulled from the water by the destroyer's crew, he found himself facing questions that his cover story couldn't answer. Petty Officer Johnson? The destroyer's executive officer stared at Chen in confusion. What the hell are you doing in the water? The Missouri reported you as missing from quarters during general quarters. Chen realized that his absence had been discovered when the Missouri had been called to action. During general quarters, every member of the crew was required to report to battle stations, and Chen's failure to appear in the engine room had triggered a search. The Missouri's crew believed that Petty Officer Johnson had somehow fallen overboard during the night, but they had no idea that he had actually been conducting a covert mission behind enemy lines. "Sir," Chen said carefully, water streaming from his equipment, "I need to speak with the commanding officer immediately. This involves classified operations." The XO studied Chen's equipment, the rebreather system, the waterproof pouches, the sophisticated navigation gear that no ordinary ship's engineer would possess. What kind of classified operations? Chen hesitated. Revealing his true identity would compromise months of careful cover and potentially endanger future UDT operations. But the alternative was facing charges for desertion and endangering ship security during wartime. Sir, I'm Lieutenant Robert Chen, UDT. I've been operating undercover aboard the Missouri for the past 6 months. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant thunder of naval gunfire. The destroyer's crew stared at the man they had just pulled from enemy waters, trying to reconcile the quiet ship's engineer they thought they knew with the revelation that he was actually a classified operative conducting underwater warfare operations. At 0630 hours, the demolition charges Chen had planted at Hungnam detonated in a series of massive explosions that lit up the dawn sky. Secondary explosions followed as fuel storage tanks ignited, creating a pillar of fire visible from miles away. To the American naval forces, it appeared that their bombardment had achieved a spectacular success against the North Korean submarine facility. But Chen knew the truth. His covert operation had just succeeded in destroying a major enemy installation, but the cost was the exposure of his identity and the end of his cover mission. As the USS Collet turned to rejoin the Missouri, Chen prepared to face the consequences of a mission that had succeeded beyond expectations while simultaneously ending his effectiveness as a covert operative. The aftermath of Chen's extraction created a crisis that reached far beyond the decks of the ships involved in the Hungnam operation. Within hours of being pulled from the Yellow Sea, Chen found himself in the unusual position of briefing senior naval officers on operations that officially didn't exist while simultaneously facing potential charges for abandoning his post during combat operations. The Missouri's commanding officer, Captain Irving Duke, received Chen in his cabin 6 hours after the conclusion of the Hungnam engagement. Duke had been briefed on the broad outlines of UDT operations in Korean waters, but he had not been informed that one of his own crew members was conducting such missions undercover. The discovery that Petty Officer Johnson was actually Lieutenant Chen represented a security breach that had implications throughout the Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant Chen, Duke began, studying the service record that had been transmitted from classified archives. Your real file makes for interesting reading. UDT training at Fort Pierce, demolitions expertise, underwater combat qualifications. But it doesn't explain why you've been serving aboard my ship under false identity for 6 months. Chen stood at attention in the captain's cabin, still wearing the coveralls that had been provided after his extraction from the water. His UDT equipment had been secured by the ship's intelligence officer, and Chen himself had been essentially confined to quarters while naval intelligence determined how to handle the situation. Sir, I was assigned to Operation Seahorse, a classified program for conducting underwater sabotage operations against North Korean naval installations. My cover as a ship's engineer allowed me to operate from frontline naval vessels without arousing suspicion. Captain Duke reviewed the mission reports that had been declassified for his review. According to this, you've been conducting operations behind enemy lines for 6 months. Destroying submarines, sabotaging harbor facilities, gathering intelligence. All while my crew believed you were just another engine room petty officer. Yes, sir. The mission required complete operational security. My cover identity was essential for accessing target areas and maintaining plausible deniability for American involvement. Duke studied Chen for a long moment. Lieutenant, your mission may have been classified, but abandoning your post during general quarters endangered this ship and her crew. My engine room was shorthanded during combat operations because my crew was searching for a man they thought had fallen overboard. Chen understood the captain's position. From Duke's perspective, Chen had violated fundamental military discipline by failing to report for battle stations, regardless of his classified mission status. The fact that Chen had been conducting authorized operations didn't eliminate his responsibility to his shipmates. Sir, I understand your concerns. But the Hungnam mission was time-critical. Intelligence indicated that the submarine facility would become operational within days. Delaying the operation would have resulted in North Korean submarines operating from hardened positions. The conversation was interrupted by a communication from Admiral Turner Joy, commander of Naval Forces Far East, who had been briefed on Chen's extraction and the success of the Hungnam operation. Joy's message was brief but significant. Chen was to be transferred immediately to Admiral Joy's staff for debriefing and reassignment to expanded UDT operations. But the transfer didn't resolve the immediate problem aboard the Missouri. Chen's shipmates, the men he had worked alongside for 6 months, were struggling to understand how the quiet engineer they thought they knew had actually been conducting secret warfare operations. The revelation had shaken the crew's trust in ways that went beyond military discipline. Chief Petty Officer Martinez, who had supervised Chen's work in the engine room, requested permission to speak with Chen before his transfer. Martinez had been responsible for Chen's performance evaluations and had consistently rated him as an outstanding engineer and reliable shipmate. "Johnson? I mean, Lieutenant Chen," Martinez said when they met in the ship's engineering spaces. "I don't understand what happened here. Were you lying to us for 6 months?" Chen looked around the engine room where he had spent countless hours maintaining the Missouri systems, building relationships with men who had accepted him as one of their own. "Chief, everything I told you about ship systems, about maintenance procedures, about engineering work, all of that was real. I am a qualified engineer. But I'm also a UDT specialist." Martinez studied Chen's hands, still stained with the grease and oil that marked a working engineer. "But why the deception? Why not just tell us you were special operations?" "Because the mission required me to be invisible. If you had known I was UDT, you would have treated me differently. You might have given me special assignments or exempted me from routine duties. That would have compromised my cover and endangered future operations." The conversation represented the fundamental challenge of covert operations conducted among friendly forces. Chen had successfully maintained operational security, but at the cost of deceiving men who had come to trust and depend on him. The relationships he had built aboard the Missouri were genuine, but they were based on an identity that was only partially true. As Chen prepared for transfer to Admiral Joy's staff, he learned the full scope of what his operations had accomplished. The Hungnam facility had been completely destroyed, with secondary explosions continuing for hours after his demolition charges detonated. North Korean submarine operations in the region had been severely disrupted, and intelligence recovered from the site had revealed details of Soviet technical assistance that proved invaluable for future operations. But Chen also learned that his extraction and the exposure of his identity had compromised the entire Operation Seahorse program. No UDT operative could operate undercover aboard frontline naval vessels if ships' crews knew that such operations were possible. The success of Chen's mission had effectively ended the program that had made it possible. Admiral Joy's briefing was classified at levels that required Chen to undergo additional security processing before receiving his new assignment. The Admiral made clear that Chen's expertise and operational experience were too valuable to waste, but that his future missions would necessarily be conducted openly as special operations rather than undercover. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Joy concluded, "your work at Hungnam may have shortened this war by months. The intelligence you gathered and the facilities you destroyed have significantly degraded North Korean naval capabilities. But your operational methods can't be replicated now that ships' crews know such operations are possible." Chen understood the implications. His success had been complete, but it had also been final. There would be no more quiet months serving as a ship's engineer while conducting covert operations. His future service would be as an openly acknowledged UDT specialist, conducting missions that carried the full authority and responsibility of American military action. The irony was profound. Chen had become so effective at his covert role that his exposure ended the possibility of anyone else operating in the same manner. He had succeeded so completely that he had made his own methods obsolete. Lieutenant Robert Chen's reassignment to Admiral Joy's Special Operations Staff marked the beginning of a new phase in underwater warfare operations that would influence military tactics for decades. Chen's 6 months aboard the Missouri undercover had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of covert operations conducted within conventional military units. Chen's new mission involved training a cadre of UDT specialists for operations that would be conducted openly as special warfare missions rather than undercover. The lessons learned from Operation Seahorse were incorporated into training programs that emphasized operational security without requiring false identities. Chen's expertise in both engineering and underwater combat made him uniquely qualified to develop procedures for operating from conventional naval vessels while maintaining appropriate security protocols. The impact of Chen's operations extended far beyond the immediate military situation in Korea. Intelligence gathered during his covert missions provided crucial information about Soviet technical assistance to North Korean naval forces, revealing the extent of Communist bloc cooperation and informing American strategic planning throughout the Pacific. The techniques Chen had developed for underwater sabotage became standard procedures for UDT operations worldwide. But Chen's most significant contribution may have been his demonstration that effective covert operations required genuine expertise in cover identities rather than merely superficial deception. Chen's success as a ship's engineer had been based on real technical knowledge and authentic relationships with his shipmates. When his true identity was revealed, his engineering work was recognized as genuinely valuable rather than merely a facade. The crew of the USS Missouri struggled with the revelation of Chen's identity long after his transfer. Many sailors felt betrayed by the deception, regardless of its military necessity. Others came to appreciate the skill required to maintain both roles effectively. Chief Martinez eventually wrote in his official report that Chen had been the best engineer and the most mysterious shipmate he had ever served with. Chen's former shipmates gradually learned additional details about his operations through unofficial channels. The destruction of the Hungnam facility had prevented North Korean submarines from operating from protected positions, potentially saving American lives during subsequent naval operations. The intelligence Chen had gathered had contributed to successful missions conducted by other units throughout the Pacific theater. The psychological impact of maintaining dual identities for extended periods became a subject of study within military psychology programs. Chen's ability to genuinely inhabit his cover identity while conducting high-stress combat operations represented a new model for covert operations. But it also demonstrated the personal cost of such deception, as Chen found it difficult to return to normal military relationships after months of maintaining false personas. Chen completed his service in Korea as an openly acknowledged UDT specialist, conducting missions that carried full military authorization and support. His operations contributed to several major victories in the final phases of the Korean War, but they lacked the psychological satisfaction of the covert missions where his individual actions had decisive strategic impact. After the war, Chen remained in naval service, eventually becoming one of the founding instructors for the Navy's SEAL program. His experience operating undercover informed training procedures that emphasized the importance of authentic expertise in cover identities. Chen's students learned that successful covert operations required becoming genuinely skilled in cover roles rather than merely pretending to possess such skills. In 1962, Chen retired from active duty with the rank of commander, his service record containing commendations for operations that remained classified for decades. He returned to civilian life as a marine engineer, working on projects that ranged from offshore oil platforms to underwater construction. His transition to civilian life was smoother than many veterans experienced, partly because his cover identity had been based on genuine technical skills that translated directly to civilian employment. Chen's story remained classified until 1987, when the Navy declassified records of Korean War special operations. The revelation that a significant portion of American underwater warfare capability had been developed by an operator working undercover aboard frontline vessels surprised military historians and contributed to scholarly understanding of covert operations during the conflict. In 1995, Chen was invited to speak at the Naval War College about the operational and ethical challenges of covert operations conducted within conventional military units. His presentation, later published in classified military journals, became required reading for special operations officers studying the integration of covert and conventional military capabilities. Chen's former shipmates from the Missouri held reunions throughout the following decades, and Chen was always welcome despite the complicated feelings surrounding his revelation. Many veterans came to understand that Chen's deception had been necessary for mission success, and that his genuine competence as an engineer had made him a valuable shipmate regardless of his hidden identity. The techniques Chen developed for underwater operations influenced military doctrine throughout the Cold War. His methods for approaching enemy installations undetected, his procedures for placing demolition charges with precision timing, and his techniques for operating from conventional naval vessels became standard elements of special operations training. Commander Robert Chen died in 2018 at the age of 93, his obituary describing him as a decorated Korean War veteran and marine engineer. No mention was made of Operation Seahorse or his 6 months aboard the Missouri under false identity. But among military historians and special operations veterans, Chen was remembered as the man who had demonstrated that the most effective covert operations were based on genuine expertise rather than elaborate deception. The USS Missouri, decommissioned and converted to a museum ship, displays exhibits about her service in Korea that include references to classified operations conducted by specially trained personnel. Visitors to the ship's engine room can see the spaces where Chen worked during his months of dual identity, though the exhibits don't identify him by name or describe the specifics of his missions. Chen's legacy lives on in the training procedures he developed and the operational concepts he pioneered. Modern special operations forces study his methods for maintaining cover identities based on authentic expertise, and his techniques for conducting covert operations within conventional military units remain relevant to contemporary conflicts. The story of Lieutenant Robert Chen reminds us that the most effective warriors are often those whose greatest achievements remain hidden from those they protect. For 6 months, Chen served his shipmates as a competent engineer while simultaneously conducting operations that helped shorten a war and save American lives. His success came not from elaborate deception, but from the genuine skill and dedication he brought to both of his roles. In the end, Chen's story demonstrates that true heroism sometimes requires hiding your greatest contributions from those who benefit from them. The quiet engineer in the Missouri's engine room was also the underwater warrior who struck decisive blows against enemy forces, and both identities were equally real, equally important, and equally deserving of recognition. The waters off the Korean peninsula continue to flow as they did in 1951, carrying no trace of the covert operations that once determined the course of nations. But in the archives of naval intelligence and the memories of aging veterans, the story of Lieutenant Robert Chen serves as a reminder that the most important battles are often fought by those whose names never appear in official histories. Chen's 6 months aboard the USS Missouri under the identity of Petty Officer Johnson represent more than a successful covert operation. They demonstrate the possibility of serving multiple roles with equal dedication, of maintaining authentic relationships while protecting essential secrets, and of achieving strategic victory through individual courage and skill. The engineering spaces of the Missouri, now silent in her role as a museum ship, once echoed with the sounds of Chen's work maintaining the ship's vital systems. Those same spaces also concealed the equipment and planning that enabled him to conduct underwater warfare operations that helped determine the outcome of the Korean War. Today, military historians study Chen's operations as examples of how individual expertise and courage can achieve strategic objectives that conventional military operations cannot accomplish. His techniques for maintaining cover identities, his methods for conducting underwater sabotage, and his procedures for operating within conventional military units continue to influence special operations training and doctrine. But perhaps Chen's most important legacy is his demonstration that effective service sometimes requires accepting the burden of secrecy. The men who served alongside him aboard the Missouri never knew that their quiet shipmate was conducting operations that protected their lives and advanced their mission. Chen carried that knowledge alone, finding satisfaction in service rather than recognition. The story of Lieutenant Robert Chen reminds us that heroism takes many forms, and that the most effective heroes are often those who remain invisible to those they protect. In an age when military service is often measured by public recognition and media attention, Chen's example demonstrates the continuing importance of those who serve in shadows and silence. Have you known someone whose greatest service was hidden from those around them? Someone who carried burdens in silence to protect others? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten but whose courage deserves to be remembered.